Well, hey, authors, welcome to our Experts for Authors conversations. We are here with Justin Atherton today. He is a SWAT breacher and detective, and I am so excited because we're going to be breaking down everything you need to know about lending authenticity to the characters that you are writing inside of your book. Justin, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to chat with you. Before we dive in, tell us a little bit about your work as a SWAT breacher and a detective.
Sure. So I've been in law enforcement over 14 years, and like you said, I've done everything from being on the SWAT team, being a detective, a training officer, supervisor. So I've run the gambit of a lot of different things you could do within law enforcement. I even teach classes on interview skills within law enforcement and leadership skills. So there's a lot of different aspects that I'm excited to share with your audience.
And I'm so thrilled that everybody is jumping in and joining us today. If you are joining us inside of our closed Facebook group, welcome. There is a link inside of the caption. Go ahead and click it and give permission for Facebook to share your name so that we can address you specifically when we pull your comments up on screen. And if you are joining us on the YouTube replay, you can come over to experts.kmrobinsonbooks.com, which will kick you over to our closed Facebook group for our upcoming live streams where you can ask experts like Justin questions in real time. And today we're going to get into this and ask questions that might help you to build out your next story. So, Justin, I want to talk a little bit about job specifications. So, when it comes to being in law enforcement, what do we need to know?
Well, that's a broad idea. I would say one thing that stands out to me that the average person doesn't realize when people get into law enforcement, when people think about law enforcement, it's like, oh, I want to be a detective. I want to go straight into that, and that's not how it works. You have to do your time like on the street as a patrol officer and work your way up through that process. And for the majority of agencies out there, it actually takes quite a while to be able to do that. In my career, it was a short time. But it was still 4 years until I was able to make detective. So I think there is a misconception that you go straight into investigations. You just want to skip all the boring stuff like working on the street. And same thing with the SWAT team. That takes a couple of years. I actually made that in less amount of time because different agencies have different versions. The SWAT team that I was part of was a part-time SWAT team. So obviously we have full-time and part-time. The part-time guys have their normal job that they do, whether they're a patrol officer or whether they're a detective. And so you train whenever you're allowed to train, and then you're normally on call. So if you're in the middle of work and all of a sudden something happens, the part-time guys are like, oh crap, I got to put down my stuff and go suit up in my other gear and then go to work. Where if you're a full-time team, the main thing that you do is train all day long and then prepare for different operations that you're going out on.
Interesting. And if you have questions while we are live, please feel free to drop those into the comments. We will be pulling those up and answering those in just a couple of minutes. And that actually leads me into another question. So we know that it does take a little bit of time. You have to kind of pay your dues to get to where you're going inside of law enforcement, especially when it comes to something like working with the SWAT team. So what are the specific qualifications that we need to know about getting into that particular part of the industry?
So, and again, different places will run it differently. So because it's such a close-knit group, what I've seen with a lot of departments and how we did it was you had to be voted in unanimously. If anyone had questions about your integrity or your ability to function in the job, there was a meeting about that. And it was like, hey, like, who thinks that this person isn't going to make it on the team? And so we had those conversations, and we made it to where it had to be unanimous, because if someone had an issue because of the heightened stress and that type of teamwork and having to have each other's back and putting your life in someone else's hands, we made it unanimous. And a lot of the things that we looked for was your ability to be proactive when you're doing something out on the street. Like, do you go out there and work, or do you just sit around and wait for something to happen? And we created a selection process that we put people through that was created some different high stress scenarios. one of them being, we call it the red man, because normally it's a training situation to where someone dresses up in a full suit, like a padded suit, and you're about to get in a fight. And and so it's a training thing that they do use in the academies, but we also used it for the SWAT tryouts, that we would, simulate a scenario to where they had to fight and see how they would respond to that situation. And most of the time I was the one wearing the red man suit. And so I got to, see what the other applicants really had. Sometimes they would surprise you in good ways, and sometimes they would surprise you in bad ways. And so it's like, well, this guy did really well, like especially like being overpowered and not being the strongest guy in the fight. And then this other guy, he didn't even put up a fight. So how can we expect him to, deal in the high stress situation, being on this type of SWAT call out? Also, you have your firearms. You want to make sure, especially with SWAT, that you are above average in your firearm skills. Obviously, once you get on the team, you will practice more often, and the requirements are higher. And so, but there has to be a baseline. If you're like one of the worst shooters in the department, are you going to make the team? Probably not. And also, if you're not physically fit, you're not going to make it either. So the average SWAT officer was a really good shot, physically fit, and able to handle any situation that was thrown at them.
Interesting. I really like that. So how much training do you have to do before you apply to become a SWAT member?
So there's not much beforehand. It's whatever you prepped yourself for. If you had already gone to some tactical schools, that's great. That gives you a leg up. But most of the time, it's about looking at your work product. Like, what have you done in the past? Have you tried to apply? Because some departments, they're not big on training, or the budgets get cut, and then training is the first thing thrown out the window. So have you been proactive on trying to go to tactical schools, trying to go to firearms schools or defensive tactics schools in order to give you an advantage when you go into this process? Normally, what we see is the training starts once you're in it, because the normal SWAT school is a 60-hour week. And it's part selection process, part training, about getting you on the same page as the team, and running you through the different scenarios, the different training briefs that they go through. But most of the training will take place afterwards. And it's like, all right, now you can go to a basic SWAT school. You can go to all the advanced firearm classes, any defensive tactics that you need to go to. So a lot of the training takes place on the back end once you get selected to be part of the team.
Interesting. Okay. So let's switch gears just a little bit. I know we talked a little bit about qualifications and how you get into this with a SWAT team member, but you also were a detective, and I want to make sure we're covering that too. So what does that transition look like from being a beat officer to a detective? What is that qualification process like?
Sure. So sometimes it's a promotion.
Okay.
And what I've seen in some departments is sometimes you have to be a sergeant first, and then you transfer over into investigations as a lateral. Other departments use it as a lateral position from patrol. And so, again, departments differ a little bit depending on what state you're in, but the main qualifications there are your ability to have good investigative skills. And similar to the SWAT team, like, have you put in for different investigative classes? Have you crafted your career in that way? Some of the things that I saw got people denied for being selected for a detective were they were just putting in for every position. So it's like they were putting in for narcotics, they were putting in for investigations, they were putting in for the traffic unit. And it was like they just wanted to do something to get off of patrol. And so a big thing is really understanding where you want your career to go and focusing on that. Like I knew I did not want to be part of narcotics. I could not be an undercover officer because I stand out like a sore thumb. You know, I'm 6'3", I'm 240 pounds. I look like a cop. And so there was no undercover work that was going to happen for me. So I realized that early and was like, well, I'll just be a detective. I'll go into investigations. And so I crafted myself while I was on patrol for that, and going to different investigative schools and just pushing myself while on patrol, pushing the investigation as far as I could. So normally not a lot of requirements. Again, the way policing works is like you get selected for a position and then now here's all the training. So a lot of the training comes on the backside of that.
Interesting. And you've mentioned that there are investigative schools and different classes and courses that you can take. Can you tell us just a little bit about how somebody in your position would find those, or where they reach out to those so that the authors can research them later on?
Sure. Well, I would say the best one to look up is the one that I'm part of, proactiveleader.com. We teach analytical interviews and leadership classes. And a lot of the police-related interview classes you could find on, there's so many different references. Like Police One is another website that they were on, patc.com, and then maybe TEEX. TEEX. So there's a lot of different classes and they'll give you a little synopsis about what the class is about. The one that we teach, we go a lot into micro expressions on the face, reading body language, understanding like pitch, tone, vocal inflection, and then going there over different ideas about like mirroring body language or mirroring speech, rapport building skills. And a lot of those transfer over into the leadership classes that we teach as well, because a lot of the emotional intelligence stuff is really transferable. Because I think one of the big misconceptions about interviewing is that everyone believes it's like a mental chess match, that it's like, oh, it's all an intellectual skill interviewing people. Really, it's an emotional skill.
Okay.
So the people that have a higher emotional intelligence, those are the people that are able to be better interviewers. I think we froze
We're back.
for a
We
second.
did
There we go.
for a second.
So yeah, the emotional intelligence really plays into, because you're able to build the rapport, whether it's with a victim, a witness, or a suspect. Those skills are the same. I think the normal interview or interrogation that you see on TV is someone like berating the person. You have to tell me the truth, and this is what's going to happen. We're going to throw the book at you. That stuff doesn't work. It may work. We joke about it because there's a certain technique that's taught to do that, and it works on first-time criminals.
Okay.
That's about where it works. But a hardened criminal, because something else, I also worked in the prison system. I worked gang intelligence in the prison system for a while, and practicing my interview skills on those guys was a completely different aspect, because they're practiced liars. They know how to talk their way out of most things, or just give you the bare minimum information, or omit things from what's being talked about. So the whole being harsh part, that only works with like your 19-year-old kid that stole from Walmart. That's okay, I did it. But the hardened criminals, that stuff doesn't work. It doesn't work with them.
Interesting. We are getting some really great questions and comments. People are very impressed with your experience. By the way, just so we're aware, people are loving this. Danielle does want to know, when you're applying for these different positions, are you allowed to apply more than once, or if you're denied, that's it?
Yes, you can apply more than once, because normally what it is I want to speak in general terms, because I don't want to just pigeonhole it into one, but a position will come open. So say there's a position on the SWAT team, or there's a new detective spot. it's almost like you put in your resume, it's gone over. The way that our selection process would go for detectives is that if there was one position, they would narrow down the interviews to three people that they would actually interview. And so there would be a discussion with the supervisors, like who deserves an interview. There's this whole like, well, my guy deserves an interview because of this. And it's like, well, no, like he doesn't because this one time this happened. So there's this whole weird debate over who deserves an interview. And if it was two positions, then they would interview 5 people. So they would adjust it a little bit. But if you weren't selected for an interview, or even if you were and didn't make it, you could always apply a different time. The first time that I applied for detective, it was a fraud investigator, and I was like, okay, I'm good with numbers. I could do that. So I put in my application for a fraud investigator. Well, what was happening behind the scenes is the other detectives get first dibs on what positions they want. And so one of the senior detectives wanted to move out of juvenile crimes and moved into the fraud investigator spot. So the position changed to a juvenile investigator spot. I withdrew my application. I was like, I do not want that. That is not what I want, because there was also like a 2-year contract that they were making you stay in that position for a minimum of 2 years because of the extra training that you would need as far as conducting juvenile investigations. So I actually withdrew my application. And then when a property crimes investigator came open about a year later, I put in for it. So yes, you can reapply. I think we did have people reapply to the SWAT team, but sometimes that was always a little bit different because people seem to get their feelings hurt when they got denied a spot on the SWAT team, because we wouldn't fill a spot just because we had applicants. Like if 5 people applied and no one qualified, we said, okay, we still don't have a spot. Like, so we wouldn't just fill it with a body of someone that wasn't right for the team. Right. So, and we would talk to the people and say, hey, look, this is what you need to work on over the next 6 months and next year. Make sure you're getting physically fit. Make sure you go shoot, get your skills up to, a good level, and come back and reapply. So yes, you can definitely reapply for those positions. Supervisor stuff too.
How many people are typically on a SWAT team? Just like, what does that number range from?
I think we had 15 people on the team, and it that's probably a good number for a team, because the other teams in the area that we worked with, their full-time team, I think they had 10 to 15 guys, and they had a part-time team that they were attached to as well, which I think they had another like 8 to 10 guys that they could help. But because of vacations, because of people getting hurt and different schedules, it's always good to have a good amount of people. And you could run an operation with maybe 6 to 7 people, but that gets a little slim. There were some times that we were hitting multiple structures at once, and so we actually had to use some of the surrounding agencies, SWAT teams as well. There were times that we had like 30 people showing up on a scene because we had multiple large structures that we needed to take control of. So, but I'd say the average SWAT team is probably around 15 to 20 guys.
Okay, I love it. I want to talk a little bit about what your average day looks like, both as a SWAT team member and as a detective. So what does that kind of look like just in terms of the basics of your everyday?
Sure. So SWAT team, the team that I was on was a part-time team. And so what happens with a part-time team is you have your normal job duties. When I started on the SWAT team, I was still on patrol. And so I still had my normal patrol shift, my normal patrol duties. And then if there was a call out, I would have to get ready to get the truck ready if I was there at work, or figure out where we need to go for the operation. If it's training day, then, we get there super early. Normally, sitting around eating breakfast. The SWAT team, we made it a point not to eat donuts. We said no. out of spite. Like in my career, I can say until probably like within the last year, I did not eat donuts out of spite. But it doesn't mean we didn't eat bad, but it was just kind of one of those things. So we'd get there early. We'd, brief for the morning, sit there and get our gear, somewhat ready. Say this is what our training plan is for the day. And then in the morning, we'd run over like, maybe some certain tactics or movements that we were working on. We would have lunch. And then after lunch, we'd run through a bunch of scenarios, putting those skills that we were practicing in the morning into use. If it was a day for a call out, we're normally in the SWAT bay, probably like 4 a.m. Everyone's, chugging their coffee, trying to wake up from the night before, depending on whether we knew that there was going to be a call out. Someone could have just gone to sleep at 2 a.m. and we got a message, saying, hey, we got a SWAT call out. Everybody needs to be in by 4. And it's like, oh man, I wish I went to bed at 8 last night.
Yeah.
So you get there early. There's a debrief about what's going on, which house we're assaulting. And, if there's another agency involved, they'll be there, whether it's maybe narcotics is involved, DEA, some other surrounding sheriff's departments, whoever's involved. We run through, the breakdown of the house, go over photos, different, if we have maybe a floor plan, we'll go over that. And then we want to make sure, normally you try to get there before everyone wakes up. So we're trying to at least hit the house by 5:30 in the morning. So it's an early day. The funny thing with the SWAT team is once you get there and, the action is like 2 minutes. That's about it. Like you ride there. Like I remember being like excited because I was the breacher. So I always had the 45-pound ram with me. That was my favorite tool to use. But I'm in the back of the truck getting amped up, knocking the front door. Once it's secure, then I go back and sit in the truck and I'm like, all right, now I'm going to take a nap until it's time to leave. Because it's like my job is done here. Let narcotics have the house, let whoever's serving the search warrant have the house, and then we go back to the department and do it like a debrief over like what went well, what didn't go well, what can we improve upon, did anybody's gear break, did we do something wrong, like just do an overall debrief for the day. So that's a long answer of what a day for a SWAT officer might look like. So
I love that. And you mentioned that you actually use certain tools as a SWAT member. Can you just kind of give us some of the ones that authors might want to look up and just be familiar with as they're writing?
Sure. So the RAM is probably the most prevalent one that you see, which is just a big steel tube with some handles on it. And we actually had, some guys at some metal shops kind of make it or reposition it, because sometimes where the handles are made a big difference for me. And actually the way that your wrist moves. So we had to make it, kind of custom. Okay. And normally that's about 45 pounds. I like the heavier one. Some of the guys couldn't swing it, but I was like, no, this is my favorite. I like the balance. I don't know what it was about it. We had a certain one. It had a good balance to it. Some of the other tools we would use would be like a hooligan, which is really the fire department uses this. It's one of those kind of the huge pry bars that you see. Okay. But if it's an outward facing or an outward opening door, you can't ram that. So you actually have to use the hooligan tool to pry it open to open it. The issue we would run into is sometimes you have like that outer door and then the inner door, and they both open opposite ways. So it's like someone would have to pop the door open from the outside, and then maybe a secondary breacher would come in and use the ram on the inside door. Okay. We also trained in shotgun breaching, which this is when I see the dynamics on TV sometimes. It kind of makes me laugh because there's certain scenarios that you wouldn't want to use this. So, and I've seen it on different police shows where they they use the shotgun to breach. Because that one, it's a little specific the way that we did it. Because if you're looking right at the door, you want to be 45-degree angles up and 45-degree angle over, so you're shooting through the throw and the top lock into the door frame as well.
Okay.
But you wouldn't want to use that if it was a metal door and a metal frame, because then you would fuse the metal together, and then that would not work for breaching the door.
No.
So if it's metal door, wooden frame, great. If it's wooden door, metal frame, like if it's opposite, it's great. Or if they're both wood, it's great. But metal and metal, not going to work. You're literally going to fuse the lock into a big tangled mess of metal. So yeah. Also, so those rounds are specific rounds that are it's like carbon. So actually, like, it probably would cause damage if you got shot point blank with it, but it's made so it would not cause like any fatal injuries if it did, hit someone inside the house. So it's mainly just for blowing out that lock. We also did train on explosive breaching, which is, using small amounts of C4 to line the door, and then and using that. That was a rare circumstance. So but I've seen that used on TV and movies as well. I think it's more military stuff, but police do use it on occasion when they feel like it's going to be an issue to get inside that house.
And that actually brings me to my next question, because entertainment sometimes gets things wrong and sometimes gets things really, really wrong. So what are the things that we need to be aware of? What have you seen that's commonly misconstrued within movies or TV shows or books? What do we need to know and fix for our stories?
Sure. Probably the most common thing has to be the tactics. I know that the majority of the TV shows out there and the movies, they don't focus on the SWAT guys. They're like the background characters, or they're in there for a specific thing that needs to be accomplished. And what I've seen is, because normally the detectives are the main characters, those are the faces of the show. So if there is an operation that they have to go and they're breaching the door and they're going in there, the number one thing I see that is inaccurate is the detectives go in before the SWAT team. It's like, no, why would they do that? They're not even wearing a full kit. They don't have any like protective gear on other than their little flimsy, vests that they're wearing. I'm like, I get it. You want their face to be in the cool shot, but it's like, no, the SWAT team goes in first, clears the building, make sure everybody's secure, and then, the detectives will come in afterwards. There was one case I was working that it was because it was while I was a detective and on the SWAT team, that it was my search warrant that they were serving on this house. Well, I couldn't be part of the operation. Like, I had to go sit in the truck and wait while the team went in there. And I was like, this is boring. I'm like, I'm not used to sitting in the truck. I'm like, man, it was a conflict of interest, because it was like they didn't want me to be involved with that, because it was me doing all the paperwork behind the scenes. And so I had to wait until it was all secure, and then I got to talk with the suspect. So the tactics about who goes in first, it's always the SWAT team's in first. Another part of that is I've seen so many shows. Like, I started watching Chicago PD recently over the last several months, because people were saying it's such a good show. And I'm like, okay, yeah, great. It is. It's a decent show. They've got good storylines, but they always let people get away. I'm like, where's your perimeter team? You're supposed to have guys on the outside that are prepared for that. Normally, we would use the brand new guys on the SWAT team as perimeter. And so it was like, because you haven't earned the right to make entry yet, you haven't been through enough reps to come inside. So the new SWAT guys get to sit out on the perimeter staring at a window. And if someone comes out that window, hey, you get something to do. So I see these shows, and I get it, because they need to let them get away. So there's a chase, and then there's all this other stuff. But that one bothers me, because I'm like, how do they keep getting away? Do you think you would learn your lesson eventually and put someone outside that's going to watch the perimeter? So that's another one that it is very inaccurate. I would say as a reference, as something that is good, the movie End of Watch. That is probably the most accurate police movie I've ever seen.
Okay.
As far as the banter in the patrol car, the different calls they go to, how they handled a lot of the different scenes. That's probably the most accurate. And I believe I watched an interview of Jake Gyllenhaal, and he said that they did ride-alongs for like 6 to 8 months with police
Oh,
officers in order to get spun
okay.
up on that. So they put in a lot of the work to really understand what goes on in the subculture of policing and being on patrol. So
Interesting. So you mentioned that they don't on television, they tend not to have those perimeters. What does that look like? How many people are on each side of the building? Is there a lot, a little? What are they specifically looking for? Because I feel like that's a good thing to flesh out in books.
sure. And again, it's going to depend on your structure and depending on how many guys you have. If it was perfect, you'd have a whole bunch of people outside. You'd have so many people inside and then so many people outside. Sometimes you're working bare minimum. Sometimes you can't get to the back of the house. So you at least, the front is normally pretty covered. But if you at least get someone on either side of the house to where if someone's able to go out either side, you can handle that. Minimum would be two. And so, and that's just for a square structure. Like say it's just the average single family home. If you had someone on opposite sides of the building, and if you were standing in a position to where you could see two directions, then you're covering the full perimeter. So technically the minimum amount of people you would need for a square or rectangular type structure would be two, and just positioning them opposite each other on either the northwest side and the southeast side or something along those lines.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned that when they actually breach a house or a structure, it's usually pretty fast. It's usually like, just a couple minutes. What does the rest of that process look like time-wise? Because I know you mentioned that they will do their investigating, they'll go through the house, they'll search everything. So overall, what does that timeline kind of look like?
Now that's going to depend on the type of investigation. So if narcotics is probably a little bit longer because they're going to search everything. SWAT will hang around if they feel like they need some security outside.
Okay.
Technically, they didn't want us being parts of the search at all. So any of the SWAT guys that were searching stuff, it's like, dude, if you find something, you're going to have to write a report. So you should probably just go like, that's why I went out to the truck. I'm like, no, I'm going to go sit out here. But you let those guys handle it. So if it's in a rougher part of town, they would have us hang out because sometimes family members would try to come to the house and
Okay.
get involved in what's going on. So we may be used for security outside the house. Inside the house, if it's narcotics, they're going to take their time. They're going to search. They're going to look in every nook and cranny. So it may be a while. If they feel like they have enough people to do it, they may dismiss us and go, hey, you guys go about your business. One thing that you made me think of, it was maybe a good detail. What we would do is after the scene is secure, we would have one of the new guys draw a diagram of the inside of the house and make it to scale. And so just like, okay, this wall is 20 feet long, the kitchen is this. And so we would have that as documentation of like the different rooms where people were. We could use it for our debrief, but also there were a couple times that we went back to the same house like 6 months or a year later. And so now we have a diagram of the house. We know exactly where things are, where the different walls are. And so it was a useful tool to where if we had to use that again down the line. So we would have someone draw it out. I was horrible at drawing, so I always tried to avoid that job, but they'd get someone in there like that liked it and would do a ruler and do all the measurements out and everything. So that was a different aspect that we would use.
That's fantastic. Talk to me a little bit about paperwork. I don't want to get too into detail here, but is there a ton of paperwork involved with SWAT?
More for the supervisors, because you have to. So there's a couple different things. There has to be, if we're planning an action plan, we have to have something drawn out beforehand, and it has to get approved. That's a little bit different if it was just a call out. Then all the paperwork would happen afterwards, and it would be an after action plan. Who was involved, the cameras that were there, what type of force was used, what property damage happened. So the supervisor would take care of all of that. And it's not a lot. Normally the guys that were planning an op, they would put together pretty much a PowerPoint and be like, okay, here's the house, here's where it's at, here's the route we're going to take, here are the people involved, here's their criminal history. So it was a lot of research up front if we knew that something was going down. But the majority of the time we had very little information, because if it was a narcotics warrant, sometimes the confidential informants, normally they're criminals. Right. And so they're not very detail oriented. And so when you ask them like, hey, is there anything inside? Because we would ask about, kids being in the house, because it would change our tactics depending on if we knew that there was children in the house. And so we'd be like, hey, did you see any like toys? Were there any like small bicycles? And sometimes they're like, no, absolutely not. No kids in the house whatsoever. But as we're heading to the house, we're tripping over like a little play set in the front yard and little bicycles. We're like, oh, this idiot. He like, he just wanted his, finder's fee. And so it definitely wasn't always accurate information that we got from those guys. But paperwork wise, the supervisors normally took care of that, or whoever was planning the operation on the front end, normally one of the team leaders would do that.
Interesting. We're getting a lot of people saying that they are definitely ready to ram a door down at this point. They're absolutely loving this. And if you've got questions, if you're joining us live, please go ahead and drop those down below. We're about to jump into those questions, and we did have some written in early that we want to make sure we are covering as well. So we do want to jump in. We are getting questions about, and I know we can't go too into detail with this, but what is the wildest or strangest or most interesting case that you've participated in, just in general terms?
I don't know how many times I've gotten this question in my career, but it's, as a detective, I don't know what was the strangest case I worked. Probably for me on patrol, the one that stands out to me is the time I got drugged 6 blocks down the street, hanging out the window of a car that I had pulled over. So that was that one hangs with me. I was actually telling the story the other day. There was it was a traffic stop that I knew the guy was coming from a drug house. I thought he had a gun in the car, and when he went to reach, he was putting it in drive, and my first thought was I needed to grab a hold of him, because if I backed up, I thought I was going to get shot. Right. So I ended up grabbing a hold of him, and then I'm doing the Fred Flintstone, running down the street, hanging out his window, and we got up to about 60 miles an hour. And I do. It's interesting when your adrenaline hits, how many thoughts you end up having in something like that. The first thing that came to mind is I need to get in this car and beat the crap out of this guy. And I couldn't get in the car because my belt was stuck on the window, and plus I couldn't get any footing because my feet are just skipping off the pavement. And I'm like, well, that's not going to work. My next thought was like, well, maybe I'll just yank him out the window and ride him like a surfboard. So I'm trying to yank him out the window, but he's just like locked in there on the steering wheel. Like he's not going anywhere. And I'm like, all right, that's not going to work either. I thought about letting go, and I realized how fast we were going. I'm like, if I let go, I'm going to get messed up. I'm like, I'm going to start rolling down the street. This is not going to be good. So I guess I'm here for the ride. My final thought was I need to shoot this guy in the face. And for me, that was the first time I'd ever made a decision to shoot somebody, but my right arm is grabbed onto him inside. My left arm is hanging onto the door frame, and my gun is pressed up against the outside of his door. I remember looking at my gun and going, that's not going to work either.
No.
luckily, the road came to a T about 6 blocks down the way, and he slows down to make a left turn. Well, I thought, no, we're not making a left turn. And so I just grabbed the steering wheel and drove us into the ditch. And
There you go.
so luckily I wasn't too badly injured, but he went to jail and then prison. But I heard he got out. And yeah, someone recently told me that he had gotten out. I said, well, tell him hi for me. So
Oh goodness. Wow. That is quite the experience. Wow. That's terrifying. I am so glad that you handled that well. That's quite a bit. That actually brings me to a good question that we had written in. They want to know a little bit about some of the things that you're feeling and experiencing before you are breaching a house or perhaps hanging out of a moving vehicle at 60 miles an hour.
yeah, that's a really good question. Like on the way, like there's this, it's for anyone that says they're not scared, they're lying. Okay. There's some low level fear going on. It's normally this anxiety, and especially knowing that you're the first person up to breach the door. So I always had like this energy and just kind of like, I'll equate it to anyone that's played sports, like right before you go out on the field, like you get like, I'm even getting chills now, like thinking about it and just kind of hyping yourself up. And it's like knowing exactly what your job is that you're about to do and just being super focused and in that moment. But like, you get a little, there is nervous energy, that anxiety, but you have to own it. There's an aspect of owning the fear, realizing it's there and making friends with it. Because what can happen and what I've seen happen are the guys that can't handle the emotions that are coming up. I've seen them run to the wrong house because they just couldn't handle what's going on. They get the tunnel vision. Their brain is not communicating appropriately with their body and they're running the wrong way. And it's like, oh, that's not good. We need him over here. So because there is a lot that goes on and you end up getting into that flow state. Because the ride there's a little bit different, but the second you jump off that truck, for me, everything would go into slow motion, which means that your brain is working super fast, right? So everything is in slow motion, seeing everything. There's this auditory exclusion that happens. You don't hear a lot. The only things I ever remember hearing are when like the flashbang would go off because that was extra loud and it almost kind of kicks you out of the flow for a second because you're like, am I getting shot at? Oh no, that's just a flashbang. And so it's interesting to be in that flow state and then, breaching the door. Because normally when I would breach the door, I would be the last person in the house. I'd breach the door, back up, the team would go in and I would grab my pistol and enter the house. So that process in itself it's weird to think about because it's your brain is doing this fast, slow stuff. But yeah, you definitely enter that flow state. But anyone that says that they're not scared for something like that, that's not reality because courage is overcoming the fear. It's not a lack of fear.
That makes sense. And you mentioned that some people don't necessarily handle it in the best way and sometimes perhaps go off course. So
Sure.
As somebody who has to handle that situation, what do you do if somebody goes to the wrong house?
Well, we realized that person was not a good fit for the team anymore because I think it happened 2 different occasions that I saw. And in one of those occasions, we were getting ready. This was before I was a breacher. I was brand new on the team. And we were doing a dual breach, which was breaching the front door and back door simultaneously, or at least that was the plan. Well, the previous breacher ran to the wrong house. And by the time he caught back up with us, we timed it on our videos. He was delayed by 11 seconds. And it may not seem like a long time, but when in that type of environment, 11 seconds is a long time because we heard the breach on the front door go off. I was on the back door team. And so we're, like I said, delayed by 11 seconds. And then the breach on the back door was kind of failed. He threw the ram through the door and and then he fell down and we had to like go over top of him. It was not good. And so what ended up happening inside it was a larger house, and this is why we decided to do a dual breach. There was bad guy number one had his room up in the front. Bad guy number two had his room in the back of the house. Well, bad guy number two heard what was happening in the front of the house and hid. So when one of the officers came through the room, he was hiding behind the door, grabbed a hold of his rifle, and now they're fighting over the gun.
Right.
And so it turned into a bad situation.
Yeah.
Luckily, everything turned out all right. But that 11-second delay led to a huge safety issue. And so we had to have a discussion about that person's ability to remain, to be part of the team. And it was decided that he did not need to be part of the team any longer.
Interesting. The second part to the question that was written in was all about how people react once you enter a structure. So now that we've kind of gotten you through the door, what does that look like in terms of how people may or may not be reacting to people bursting into their homes?
So for me, since I opened the door, but I normally wasn't the first one in there. Some of the stories that I had from some of the other guys was so that we had one that we were doing as a breach and hold, which is different than a dynamic entry. So we would breach the door, and then several officers would have their guns pointed inside the living room because there was maybe a lot of unknowns. So one story, this may have been the one where I was having to wait in the truck, but they said 4 different officers pointing their guns inside the house once the door was breached, and the guy was standing in the living room. They said the way his body moved was like he was getting shot, and no shots were being fired. So they literally said he was twitching and moving and trying to dodge and just like, oh no. And they replayed the video afterwards, and they're like, what was going on with this guy? It was like psychologically he was getting shot.
Okay.
Because he just saw these guns pointed at him, multiple weapons pointed at him. And so in his head, he's getting shot. And so he was reacting as if he was getting shot. So, but you see all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, when you go into someone's house unannounced, you see all kinds of stuff. You're going to see naked people. You're going to see people doing drugs. You're going to see people hiding. We scared a dog once really bad. It was this huge pit bull. This thing, he was massive, right? But what I think happened is that he was sleeping in the living room, and when the flashbang went off in the front door, this dog tried to get out the kitchen window. So he was in the kitchen sink trying to get out the window. That didn't work. So we made entry. We saw this dog. Like, this dog probably had to be at least 150, 160 pounds. I was like, oh no. Like, this dog, if he attacks one of us, he's probably going to get shot. Luckily, the dog was still scared. He just ran out. I don't think we ever found that dog. He never came back to see how that turned out. So
oh my goodness. So what happens when you do breach a structure and there are animals like that, and perhaps you don't know that that's coming? What do you do in that case?
We try to plan for that. Normally we have some type of idea that there are animals there. If you can use your pepper spray for the animals, that's probably the best way. Obviously, if you are getting attacked, an animal may end up getting shot. We had one, we didn't think this was going to work. We were going to a house that they had like 6 or 7 dogs in their front yard, like different pit bulls tied to trees. It was almost like a minefield of dogs. Like, we were like, how are we going to do this? Well, one of the guys on the team was like, oh man, I'm going to bring some lunch meat and I'm going to feed him, and like, it's going to be all right. And we're like, dude, that's not going to work. The dog's going to eat you. Like, we're like, well, we're just going to have to go through, maybe pepper spray some of the dogs. So I guess the lead dog was kind of by the fence that we were going over, and he fed him that lunch meat. He started to bark a little bit. He fed him the lunch meat. The other dogs were like, oh, you must be cool, because none of them barked at us. They're like, oh, you fed, Spike over there? Great. Oh, you must be cool. So they left us alone. We were like, well, that's good. It worked out for the best.
Yeah.
But we were a little nervous on that one because, like I said, there was like 6, 7 pit bulls tied to different trees, but yeah, it worked out.
I imagine. Wow, that's crazy. People are loving these stories in the comments. We did have an interesting question, which I feel kind of parlays off of the fact that you are possibly being attacked by dogs, and by the grace of God, you did not get attacked by those dogs. We do have an author who wants to know, do you see a lot of people within SWAT teams and even within law enforcement that are deeply faith-based or religious-based, or do you find kind of the opposite where they do not have a lot of that? Is there a mixture of that, or is there something kind of you see more toward the trending side of things?
I would say that the majority of the guys are religious, but probably don't go to church on a regular basis. So I don't think I've met a lot of atheists that are police officers, and it's an interesting concept to me because, you know, I like the idea that I'm gonna go down fighting. Like if something happens to where I have to fight for my life, like I'm going to do whatever it takes to live through that or take the person down with me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I've heard some other officers talk about it differently, and they're like, "Well, if it's my time to go, it's my time to go." I personally disagree with that because we can all expedite certain things to make it our time to go, or make that hurry up and arrive, whether that's not paying attention to your surroundings, whether that's driving unsafely, not, frisking a guy when you should. So I don't subscribe to that idea of when it's your time to go, it's your time to go, because I'm going to do everything I can to prevent that from happening. But to answer the question, I think the majority of officers are religious, but maybe not technically church goers.
Got you. That makes sense. We had another question that came in that's talking a little bit about how the world is moving toward more of an inclusive environment when it comes to, race and gender and body types and things like that. Do you feel like that is kind of shaping the way that these career paths are going, or does that end up like a non-issue for this? Are you seeing it kind of shape who is being included in these different types of occupations, or no?
I don't think so. I think there, like a long time ago, like before my time, I remember people saying that they were very strict physical guidelines to being a police officer. A good friend of mine, his dad tried out for LAPD back in the 70s, and he was a bodybuilder. And so he didn't make the height weight requirement because he was a bodybuilder, and they were like, it was like the old military standards. Well, if you're 6'1", you have to weigh exactly 183 pounds. And that was the standard that they used to have, which I think is completely ridiculous. But you look at it nowadays, obviously those standards aren't there. There are officers that are out of shape. And I think this question comes in with, females being in law enforcement. And I don't think that it has anything to do with gender, but it is interesting because I've worked with some male officers that were smaller guys. And if you're unable to, protect yourself, it does change the psychology a little bit. Because for me, I'm a bigger guy. I don't go to my bat belt, right? Like I don't go to my tools often because I can handle a situation with my two hands. And so, but the smaller guys, they have to use their tool. They might use their taser, they might use their pepper spray or their baton or their gun. And so it is a different psychology that comes into it when you are a physically smaller person. And what also plays into that in different states, the laws are a little bit different, but when it comes to use of force and use of deadly force, the size discrepancy between the officer and the suspect is important. It's an important piece of that. So for me, I can't argue that unless Shaq shows up and, and I have to fight him one-on-one, I'm not going to be able to use that aspect. But a smaller officer, male or female, doesn't matter. If you're 5'3", 120-pound officer, and you have to fight a guy that's 6 foot, 300 pounds, it makes a difference. So I don't see that any of the changes exclude people. I haven't seen that play a factor.
Fantastic. We are getting some great questions in here. Danielle would like to know, is there a certain age that people typically retire, or is this one of those things where they can kind of go as long as they want and then maybe just shift around with what they're responsible for based on what they're able to accomplish?
Sure. So it's an interesting question because different retirement policies have what's called normally like the rule of 80, which means you have to add your age plus your years of service together to at least equal 80. So say you started being a police officer when you were 21. If you worked 30 years, you'd be 51. And if you added it together, you'd be 81. So you could retire at 29 years, which that sounds horrible to work in one career for 29 years before you can retire. Obviously, if you start older, the numbers change. What I have seen for the guys that retire is that they stay longer than it's required. Either working those retirement numbers, or they realize, what else am I going to do, at this point?
Uh-huh.
And then once some of the guys retire, a couple things happen. They either stay around the police department more because they're like, I miss it. I want to be involved with it somehow, even though you were complaining for the last 15 years that you want to retire, but now you want to be around it more. Or, police officers in general don't have a very long lifespan. I think the average age of a police officer is 58, and that's
Wow.
very young. And so it's one of those careers that you attach a lot of your self-identity to. And so once you retire and you're removed from that career, it's like, who am I? Who am I now? And so, it's a sad thing to see, but I know it happens in other careers. But some people retire and shortly after that they die because they lost their purpose.
Right.
And that's I think that's more prevalent with men than it is for women, in those type of
Mhm.
factors. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. If you can get into a cush position and you can just kind of soak it out, sure, some of the guys will do that. But if you're in the promotion line, that's like, oh, well, if I just promote one more level and lock in that pay, sometimes that becomes a motivator. So you can get a higher retirement payout. So if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And if you are joining us live, this is your last call to get your questions in. Now is the time. We're going to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes. We do have a couple questions that we want to get to, but if you are joining us live, now is the time to get those in. And if you're on our YouTube replay, head over to experts.kmrobinsonbooks.com. Join the group because we have more experts coming up over the next couple of weeks, and we're really excited to get those people introduced to you as well. Danielle did jump in, and she says, if somebody has a criminal record or their family member specifically has a criminal record, would that person be automatically disqualified from working as a detective or a SWAT member? So would other people in their family affect their career?
So the first part of that would be if themselves, if they had it. Normally, if you've committed any type of crimes, especially a felony, is an automatic disqualifier, even to be a police officer. Most states, if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor, it needs to be at least 10 years after the disposition of that misdemeanor. So say if you were convicted for theft when you were 18, you wouldn't be able to apply to be a police officer till you were 28. Family members, not so much. It could be a factor in your background because technically your police officers are not supposed to associate with known felons. If it is a family member, obviously that's going to be a case-by-case basis. But that it does happen, but as long as it's not, something that they feel is going to affect your judgment on the job, or if you're doing favors for somebody or letting people off that, it's like if your dad's a felon and you're letting his buddy off because of favoritism, that would be an issue. So in general, felonies are going to be disqualifiers, even being a police officer, not just SWAT detective, just entry level police. And then misdemeanors, it's going to be a time frame. What I've seen is 10 years or more.
Interesting. Very interesting. This has been a very enlightening chat. Do you feel that there is anything else that authors need to know to make sure that we get your occupations correct inside of our writing?
You know, I'd say it's one thing you and I talked about before we got on here was on scenes of dead bodies. And this is something that, you know, it gets some negative public perception. But police officers joke around on the scene of a dead body. And it's not because they're heartless and they're cold. Normally it's because, you know, it's a coping mechanism. I know for myself, I don't like going to the scene of dead bodies, you know, whatever the circumstance, whether it's a homicide, whether it's a suicide. I literally have a Rolodex of all the dead bodies and all the seriously injured people in my head that I can see. And I don't like that. I don't like having that. I don't like adding to it. So if I can avoid going to one of those scenes, I do. There are other officers that I know are interested in seeing death and interested in seeing that. But one of the things that is prevalent, and we make it a point, if the public is around or if the news is there, to not be as joking. But there are times, I know I've made some really bad jokes. One scene, I remember someone killed themselves. I think it was on accident. It was kind of one of those autoerotic asphyxiation type deals. And my first comment was, well, I bet he won't do that again. So, but it's a coping mechanism, right? It's not me being a joke. It's so that's an interesting insight for anyone that out there, you know, get an inside look, the police officer's brain, how we deal with death.
Fantastic. And I really like that you pointed that out as well, because I feel like sometimes we see a little bit of that in entertainment, but it really is something that, you know, does happen. And I feel like we need to normalize that a little bit, because it's very much something that does help you cope with it and get you through it psychologically and emotionally. And I feel like that's a good thing to make sure that we're including inside of our writing as well. All right, we are at the end of our time. Before I let you go, I know that you are doing some very interesting things in your career right now. So tell us a little bit about where people can connect with you and what you're doing right now.
Yeah, the project I'm working on right now is connected with my business, and I run Confidence Unchained, which is a consulting business that works with men helping men. Like I coach men one-on-one. I use a lot of the law enforcement skills that I've gained in my career to help them in that process. And I'm running a virtual summit that is coming out at the end of February 25th, 26th, and 27th, where I think we have 28, 29 different amazing speakers that are talking on anything from you know, mental health, emotional intelligence to fitness. So the best way to find me is on my website, confidenceunchained.com. The summit is under summit.confidenceunchained.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, either under Justin Atherton or Confidence Unchained. So I'm really excited about the summit coming up, though.
That sounds fantastic. Justin, thank you so much for hanging out with us today and giving us all of your great knowledge and insight. This has been absolutely incredible. And I am so excited that this was our very first episode. And I would love to have you back a few months from now and get some more questions answered for people. I hope everyone will connect with you. Friends, if you are joining us, stay tuned, because in just a few days, we will be hanging out with Airline Captain David Root. He's going to tell us all about his time in the Air Force. He is a pilot. There's all sorts of really great information he's going to share with us. We've got a molecular anthropologist coming. We've got a lawyer, all sorts of amazing, fantastic people coming to give their insights and knowledge to help you lend authenticity to the things that you are writing. And we appreciate each and every one of you being here today. Justin, this has been incredible, and we cannot wait to have you back. Thank you so much, and we will talk to everyone soon. Have a great day, everyone.